morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Tony Lin. I'm a partner at DLA Piper, and I am the moderator for today's breakout session, breakout panel entitled Implementing Policies for Success of On-Orbit Services. So for the next 55 minutes, we're going to be discussing on-orbit services, policies and regulations, and exploring questions like whether the current policies and regulations are helping or hurting the on-orbit service industry, and what, if anything, we should be doing differently. The panel discussion is intended to be interactive, so please feel free to chime in, raise your hand, we'll call on you and get your questions answered. You also have the ability to speak, so please don't be shy. To start things off, I'm going to turn it over to the panelists to introduce themselves and provide any opening remarks they'd like to make. So I'll start with Joe.
Thank you, Tony. So my name is Joe Anderson. I'm the Vice President of Space Logistics, Business Development, and Operations Activities. Of course, we own and operate the MEV. Took the picture that you see right behind us here, the Intelsat 901 spacecraft. The process of getting this service in orbit has been a long and extensive one. For me, started in 2012 with the regulatory activities. I think we actually began that process in about 2013. Talking initially with the FAA and then other elements of the U.S. regulatory agencies, working out until we ultimately got our licenses in probably 2018, 2019 timeframe when we had those licenses finally concluded, resulting in the need for two different licenses, one from the FCC, which becomes our oversight agency for the U.S., aligned with the Outer Space Treaty, and then another license that we're required to have here in the U.S. for remote imaging from space, and that is managed through another license we have with NOAA. So it's been a great experience going through that process. I will say that the agencies were very supportive and trying to help us, pave the way through this. They were not established to do services like we're doing, so it was quite an adventure. And look forward to the panel here, Tony.
Thank you, Joe. Will?
Hi, I'm Will. I am CEO and co-founder of Here Robotics. We're actually based in Sydney, Australia, so it's 1 a.m. here right now. You can probably see the dark behind me. And what we do, I'm sure heaps of you, or most of you probably haven't heard of our company before. What we do is we have a new take on inspection in space. So we do what we call flyby inspection, which means that we have a series of cameras in space, and we wait until they fly really close to targets that we're interested in, and then we image those targets when we're really close. So it's just a really cost-effective way of doing inspection, not quite as high resolution as Joe's MEV image, but pretty damn good resolution. So what we do, we use 25 different Earth observation cameras today, and we transform them using software into inspection cameras. And we've been operating for the last year and a half and continuing to grow our capability and customer base. So it's really interesting, the regulatory environment that we have in Australia. We've got a strange situation where I think we never believed we'd have this kind of capability and this kind of problem to worry about, so we never regulated against it, which is really interesting when we work with US customers, because obviously the regulations in the US are relatively more advanced, so there's a bit of a interesting interplay there. And because we work with Earth observation cameras, we also work with multiple different jurisdictions, because those come from a variety of suppliers as well. So really keen to be here and to engage in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Aya?
Yes, hello, good morning and good evening, everyone. My name is Aya Iwamoto. I'm a lead Japan Space Policy, Astroscale Japan, and it's 12 a.m. here in Tokyo. 1 hour probably better than Will. And as you know, that Astroscale is the first private company with the vision to secure the safe and sustainable development of space for future generations. And we are the only company dedicated on orbit servicing across all orbit. So today's topic is about regulations. In Japan, there are two main sort of regulators, one for the remote sensing, spectrum license, that is Ministry of Information Communication. The other launching mission license and remote sensing license is basically Cabinet Office. And there might be people who have listened or watched yesterday's Japan's Cabinet Office presentation on supplementary requirement for an orbit servicing mission. And currently, Astroscale, we have launched our first demo mission called LCD, which was licensed in UK and registered Japan. And we are also working on ADRAS-J mission, ADRAS-J spacecraft mission that was selected by JAXA for the phase 1 of commercial removal of debris demonstration project, CRD2, which are going to be licensed by Japan. So it's very new and exciting time for us, and very happy to join this panel and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Aya. And now we'll turn to the final two panelists who are not commercial parties, but have a government perspective. Ezine?
Thanks, Tony. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. I am Ezine Uzo Okoro. I am the Assistant Director for Space Policy here at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. We call that OSTP, and I am happy to join in on this forum today to mostly highlight two relevant activities that I think that this community cares about. One is on-orbit servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. And the other is orbital debris mitigation. And we are working, OSTP is working closely with Space Council to lead an interagency working group that will focus on 4 main areas. The first is developing additional regulation for the growing OSAM sector and space activities. The second would be maintaining U.S. leadership in OSAM technology and technology development and demonstration in space. The third would be ensuring that we establish international and private sector cooperation and coordination through development of additional standards and best practices. And the fourth is improving regulatory coordination between OSAM and orbital debris mitigation communities. So I look forward to sharing more about that and answering your questions, and also engaging with you all over the next year or so, because one thing that we believe here at OSTP and Space Council is that it is important for us to receive community input from the private sector and academia and other non-US government partners in order to ensure that we are developing policy and regulations that best suit the community. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. I'll be sending you an email right after this panel to set up a meeting. Andy.
Great, thanks, Tony. Hi all, my name is Andrew Ratcliffe. I'm Chief Engineer at the UK Space Agency. So for those who aren't aware, the UK Space Agency leads civil space activities within the UK. So my team specifically provides technical oversight to those activities. So looking at the assessment capabilities and providing that technical assurance within the agency itself. So on regulatory topics, I've been involved over the last few years in terms of the UK's approach to regulating launch and orbit servicing activities. So I'm really here today to just provide some insight into some of the UK approaches in terms of our oversight and regulation, and also some of our international work that we do on these emerging policy areas. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. So the first topic that I'm hoping to discuss today is kind of just establishing what the current framework is. I know that Joe covered a little bit of that at the beginning, talking about his licensing experiences, but maybe we could just take a step back and get a little bit more fundamental and leave it to and ask the folks in the government, in the regulatory bodies, or having oversight or policy direction for them, how agencies, administrations view policies and regulations, and what is the current environment for operators seeking to provide on-orbit services. So with that kind of broad area, I'll turn it back to Andy and get his comments about the UK.
Great, thanks, Tony. So just to provide some insight into the UK's approach then. So within the UK Space Agency is involved in overarching regulatory policy. So we develop the approaches to areas such as sustainability and other areas. But in terms of regulation, in terms of the authorization and supervision of UK operators, that comes from our Civil Aviation Authority. So the CAA have been established as the UK spaceflight regulator. So within that role, they work through a number of cycles. So they're involved in pre-application engagement. So they engage very early, or they try to engage very early with the companies to really understand what the mission is, to understand what the risks and what the total operations associated with the mission are. And we have a process associated with that. It's an optional process called the traffic light assessment, which really tries to look into the way that these missions are going to come together and give some steer on some of our understandings and potentially risks that might be associated with the mission itself. Once the mission has been identified and they move into the full application process, there's a number of assessment principles that we look at across safety, security, sustainability, and responsibility. So there's a number of areas that from a technical perspective, that the regulator will try and delve into, really understand what the mission is about and how it really matches up to international best practice and guidelines and sort of standard approaches that we've seen globally. And really that's where a lot of our international engagement comes in. So we work the UK more broadly across the agency and the CAA, and our partners across government are very active at international forums, from the IADC to UN COPIUS and even forums such as CONFERS, to really try and understand what that best practice looks like. So when we identify these upcoming missions, we're really benchmarking them against what the community sees as good practice. So hopefully that gives you a bit of insight into the UK approach, and happy to answer any questions going forward.
It does. So let me just put my lawyer hat on for a second, and not meant to be the third degree. Just wondering, because I often get these questions, and I don't deal with the UK administration, but just really basic questions like, is there a sense of how long the process is, cradle to grave or cradle to grant, and that type of really basics?
So each I should say it depends. It depends on the mission. So it depends on the complexity associated with that mission. So obviously there's a range of missions which may range from a geostationary satellite that's providing communications, and so there are certain things we'll look into, but they're probably quite standard missions, all the way through to what we see more recently, maybe with ELSA-D, where there's complexities associated with the mission operations. So it really does depend on the mission itself, and the key thing that our regulator encourages in our engagement is to engage early with the regulator, to share the mission, to share insights of what's being planned, so that the risks can be explored together between the regulator and the operator.
Got it. Brian, I think you have a question.
Well, yeah, I was gonna. There was something that came up on the previous panel we didn't get to because we didn't really have a policy regulatory focus, but it was about salvage rights, and I want to throw that out there, both because I know it came up several times, both for sort of operators like Joe. How important do you think that is for sort of a future servicing business, and then to the government people? you know, and I as well, how do you think we get to sort of a discussion about establishing some sort of a regime where you can reuse and recycle space debris and other space objects? You know, how much of that should be coming from sort of the private sector? How much of that is going to require coming from governments?
So I guess I'll start a little bit there, Brian, because you asked, from a commercial perspective, how important is salvage rights? And certainly as we start looking into, debris removal, recycling, things of that sort, that can become important. I think initially, I don't think that will be as much of an issue. I think initially we will be servicing, recycling, removing debris for clients that already own those assets versus going after debris that maybe there is no known owner or state registry to that asset. I think that's probably a little further down the path, but ultimately that will become important. I think there is some critical debris in certain orbits that should be removed, and it may be very difficult to discern ownership of that debris and salvage rights to remove it if it's interfering with other operators. So at some point, I think that will become very important, but I think that is probably a little ways down the timeline here. I don't think that's currently preventing any commercial business at this time.
It's actually great to hear Joe say that it will be timely soon and not right now, because as you all know, we always try to ensure that policy policy and regulations are in place before it's actually needed. And we are, OSCP and Space Council are working on this, leading this working group in order to determine consensus from industry and other stakeholders, as well as obviously from the U.S. government, to ensure that we conduct more of a thorough assessment and we prepare R&D, technical, regulatory, and policy solutions for commercial companies and others who need these, who will require FCC or other U.S. interagency licensing and support.
Thanks, isn't it? So that's actually kind of leads to another interesting area or topic. If space debris or salvage rights aren't relevant now, what types of services are up and coming in which new policy issues are being raised? And what are those services? What are those policy issues? Will, how about I turn that to you?
Thanks so much, Tony. I'm actually really excited to go next because I think some of these issues are coming up now. So we spoke about salvage rights, especially of bodies where you can't discern the owner, and I think that's so critical. But even critical before that is identification of objects. And at the moment, in my mind, in the US, this isn't a problem in Australia. So we're very happy to keep doing the business that maybe you in the US cannot at this time. But I believe you can't even image objects where you can't get permission from the owner. So if you can't discern who the owner is, how do you get permission? And already this year, there are 72 objects that have been launched just this year where the US government can't distinguish who the owner of those objects are. So these are satellites that are launched. Oftentimes they just don't turn on for whatever reason. And there's no current way of even the operator understanding which satellite belongs to them. And then sometimes on top of that as well, you have maybe non-cooperating parties from different nations who aren't letting on which satellite is which. from a specific launch as well. So I think a lot of these problems are starting to surface now, and really could be an issue as more satellites launch and there are more potentials for collisions, etc. It really does become important that we know things like ownership, and it's really difficult to do that when you can't even image a certain object from a certain jurisdiction to really understand identity.
Thanks. Well, I hadn't appreciated that. So what you're saying is that I take it Australia has a liberal non-Earth imaging regime.
I wouldn't say it's intentionally liberal, but I very unintentionally liberal. And that allows us to really, I guess, explore how this problem might be solved. Whereas in the US, it's already very heavily regulated, and I appreciate sometimes it's better to go forward and regulate first, but it maybe Australia is where we experiment with on-orbit service regulation, and maybe in the US we can learn from that and regulate accordingly.
Great. No, thanks for that. Aya, do you have any comments on the upcoming missions and services?
Sure, thank you. You know, I think in a way in space, I think always actual practices or demonstration or technology precedes the regulations. So first of all, in general, I think this is why it's very important regulators to build in flexibility into the regulations without being too prescriptive, because there will be always new and novel missions, and these are path to licensing for these. And also other part is the future of space mission will always be inherently global. So as some of the things Joe and Will have already mentioned, but I think there could be legal complicated issues that require regulators to coordinate together. And particularly we are sometimes talking about one servicer serves like multiple clients. What if multiple clients belongs to different countries? So these kind of things. And I think, and first of all, to provide a service to the client, we need to get a consent to the client satellites. And it's fine I think it's kind of easier to think of to get that consent from the commercial company. But what if the procedure to get the consent from the states that have jurisdiction over client satellites? I don't think there's no standard things. It shouldn't be that difficult, but as Joe said, there's a case that you cannot find registries or client satellites is not registered, or cannot find states that have jurisdiction over client satellites. And also, I don't know, maybe there could be issue of export control. We need to get information on the client satellites, and I'm not sure about, but it could be. And what about the allocation of liability if multiple states relate? Is it possible, like, cross waiver agreements among like-minded states, just like IAS or things like that? So I think we're in a very exciting time in terms of international law, and there's many things, and we need to use imagination. And what would happen if we apply to these legal issue and stuff? So thank you.
Really good points. Joe, did you want to add something?
Yeah, if I could add a few points, and just to amplify one of Aya's points there, certainly cross-state servicing, right? So even within our next missions, I talked about this morning in the welcoming address, right? We've got 7 potential mission extension pod customers here, or 6 customers, 7 different satellites. Those go across, and none of those are US customers. So they go across multiple different states. And so one of the challenges I think we're going to face in the very near future is that coordination of, okay, we're going to have a US servicer that's going to be installing and doing a service on a non-US asset, and we have to have those regulators in agreement on how that's going to happen. So that's going to be one of our near-term challenges that we're going to have to address and tackle. The two other areas, I think Will brought one up, imaging, absolutely. In the US, we're very restricted on our imaging capabilities. I think that is going to hinder our industry in the US, and we have to get over that and recognize that space is a free place, and that, you know, we should be able to image things in space, and we shouldn't be restricted from that. Right, it is an open international space. So we have to work through that regulatory challenge within the US. And then the third area is in telemetry and commanding. You know, so more and more of these servicers are starting to get launched. Having the frequencies and to do the telemetry and commanding with these servicing vehicles is going to be really crucial to enable the industry to grow. And today there is no spectrum that is allocated to these types of missions. So identifying where there is some spectrum available for supporting these is going to become really more and more critical.
Thanks, Joe. It's a great segue into kind of the next topic of, you know, what needs to be done. And you've highlighted a number of, I think, big ticket items, which is
next in your Spotify queue.
Sorry, my iPhone is talking to me. Frequencies, number one. You know, what kind of policy changes could be effective there, and restrictive regulations. And not necessarily because it was designed that way, but maybe it was just application of old rules, or adherence to old rules that don't really fit to this structure. So if we could just spend a second there and turn it over to the folks on the regulatory side, on the government side, and ask what their thoughts on those types of regulatory changes, policy changes, and get their perspective on that.
I can go first. Just from our side then, I think so one of the key things in the UK, particularly with the regulations that we've introduced, they're largely performance-based. So they set objectives that then the operator then identifies the approach that they'll take, essentially. And then against that, the regulator then reviews the approach and understands whether that satisfies what we understand to be best practice and approaches that are adopted globally. So that's why I think forums such as CONFERS, where there is this best practice being pulled together, is so important for the regulators, so we understand from sort of a bottom-up perspective, from these operational experiences, what we should be looking for in our license assessments. I think one of the key things for the industry at the moment is that we are moving from, we're transitioning from this sort of tech demo framework to now an operational service, and then understanding whether the expectations from a tech demo point of view is the same as what we expect from an operational point of view, because the level of risk and safety associated with those operations potentially needs to improve. And that's where it's good to see the work that CONFERS is doing in the standards community, because these standards are coming together, they're developing more detail in terms of what the expectations are and what's essentially required. I think linked to that as well from sort of a regulatory point of view, there's also the recognition of supervision. So the Outer Space Treaty talks about authorization and supervision. From a supervision point of view, we have a perspective from traditional missions. So within the UK, we require elements such as annual health checks on our operators to understand how the spacecrafts are performing. But as we move towards more of these on-orbit servicing missions, where there are more complex operations, what is needed to understand whether the operation has succeeded, has been performed successfully. So these are the kind of work that we're doing here in the UK between ourselves and the UK Space Agency, and then with our regulatory partners at the CAA.
I'll start with something Will said that is interesting, that Australia is looking to regulate after the fact, and that's something we certainly will be watching to see the effects of that. And then moving on to Joe's comments and recommendations, I think that's why forums like this are important for the government to be part of as a listener, because it's important for us to track these, and we are tracking some of these. So I'm glad to say that particularly the issue of cross-cutting states and our orbit servicing clients that Joe, you may have, that's something we are looking and tracking and working on. But it's great to see that the trajectory that we've been on, because actually 3 years ago, OSCP hosted a roundtable, and some of you may have been there, between government, industry, and academia to discuss some of these challenges and opportunities of on-orbit servicing. And at that time, there wasn't an overwhelming consensus actually to develop some kind of national strategy, although there was consensus to just conduct more specific interagency coordination and perhaps technology transfer. But obviously since then, worldwide interest in OSAM capabilities has grown, and there are lots of initiatives being set up on orbit servicing across the interagencies, and there are capabilities and technologies and definitions discussions with CONFERS, without CONFERS, and I know that we are, this interagency working group that I mentioned that we just kicked off is working to develop a national strategy that will address some of these concerns. So in a number of realms, R&D, technical, and with policy solutions. So we certainly are tracking and looking to ensure that on-orbit servicing can enhance opportunities for international cooperation in space amongst U.S. And non-U.S. companies, and also help to maintain America's leadership in that area. So we are actively working on adopting and deploying more of these regulatory solutions.
Thanks. I just wanted to touch back on a comment that Will and Andy both sort of made and suggested, and maybe I read too much into it. But one of the things I heard Will saying was that as a result of the newness of this, the regulator, the agencies in Australia have a lot of flexibility to maneuver. And what I heard from Andy was, bring us all your information, we'll evaluate on a case-by-case basis to help move the process along. It sounds like because there aren't established rules, there can be greater flexibility. That's what I'm hearing, and I just want to make sure that is in fact the message you were suggesting. And then I wanted to ask others whether that has been their experience as well. I can see it cutting both ways, right? You could say the current rules are not designed for this, so they can be interpreted flexibly to help or to hurt. And so there's a number of ways to go about that, and it's really, where the rubber meets the road. How are they being interpreted? And in many cases, there are multiple agencies, so maybe someone is trying to help, and it's not like intentional, not trying to hinder, but saying, well, we feel our hands are tied, and the rules are this, even though it wasn't designed for you. Maybe we have to interpret them this way. So I'll stop there and turn it back to Will and Andy.
Tony, I feel like you've asked the big question of this panel, or the question that seems to be emerging. So it feels like the rules were definitely made for another purpose, and we should be cognizant of why they were made. And now we have these new needs that are emerging with this new industry. So it would be really great to bring everyone to the table. I mean, let's call them out. It's defense and national security industries that used to create these rules in space, and they're really hard to bring to the table. But I think it's probably time to have this discussion, and it could even go as far as, you know, if you're really concerned about someone else imaging or getting close to your satellite that has national security issues attached with it, then why the heck is that visible from the outside of the satellite in the first place? Or maybe there are other solutions that we can come to. So it'd be really great to have both sides come to the table. And Tony, I think you hit the nail on the head there.
Just to add to that, Tony, I think the point is that from a regulator's point of view, there are international obligations. So there are obligations that through authorizing and allowing these missions to occur, that the nation states need to adhere to. I think the demonstration of how we're meeting those international obligations is the point that's open in terms of what we're expecting from the operators to ensure that we only regulate those activities that we're confident that will meet the requirements within the community, essentially. So that's why we work so hard at forums such as the IADC, STSC, on a range of other international arena to really try and understand what good looks like, and then that's what we then take to then apply to sort of UK missions that we'd look to license.
Thanks, Andy. Anyone else want to add to that?
Well, I would add just a little sense from, you know, the experience we've had going through the US system. You know, as you said, Tony, that I think, you know, the regulatory regime is not set up to do what we're doing today, right? It was established for what's been known in the past. We do communication satellites and we have a good regime set up for that. We have Earth imaging satellites and we have a regime set up for that. And those are set up to make sure that, you know, those types of systems are aligned with the international agreements that we have for imaging certain parts of the Earth, perhaps, or for coordinating frequencies around the Earth through the ITU. So here we come with a different type of a system that doesn't necessarily fit either one of those. And I would say, you know, within the US, for our particular service, we were able to navigate that, and those agencies did help us. They wanted us to succeed, and they found a way to do it. I think it has helped kick off, and that's one, I mean, we're one reason, I think, why the US is looking at trying to formulate a new way to do licensing for space, sort of a mission-based, you know, licensing activity. You know, it's proceeding with fits and starts, but it's proceeding, and I think that will be helpful overall for our you know, industry as that progresses. So I just wanted to add that little bit there, that, you know, yeah, there were these regimes, but we've been able to sort of thread that needle through those to date. That might get more and more difficult as these missions get, you know, more diverse.
Yeah, and I think that's a key point. So, you know, as the first, essentially, or one of the first, there could be a lot of time and effort devoted to this novel effort. But as there are many more folks coming down the pipeline, are these agencies going to be able to set aside all of these individual meetings to evaluate one-off cases in each instance? So I'll ask a generic question for our regulatory, the policy folks on the government side. Is there something else we should be doing? Should we be establishing processes? Should we, I know you've mentioned, Esne, that you're having these internal meetings, you've established working groups, and you're discussing all of these issues, orbital debris, in-orbit services, on-orbit missions. Is there something else we should be doing? I'll give you an example. The FCC initiated a rulemaking proceeding recently, not specifically about on-orbit services, although it does touch that, but really about launch services, noting the change in the commercial launch industry and asking, hey, should we be doing something different with our regulations? Should we be streamlining this process? Should we be changing this? Every launch requires one application process to something a little bit more industry friendly. Are those types of efforts something we should be engaged in?
I can start. I think it's pretty clear to us that the nations that adopt and deploy on-orbit servicing as part of a national space operations strategy will lead in space for the next decades ahead. So with that said, one thing that industry can be doing is, and Joe described some of this, is to work as closely with the regulators and with the interagency, because, and also with different stakeholders in the policy realm, because we need to understand and learn of not just the regulatory needs, but the technologies that are being developed, because for us to move ahead and ensure that we are not, we are being as supportive and as forward-thinking, then it's important for us to know what's in the pipeline. And, you know, these working groups look at the U.S. government as a whole and the U.S. government needs. And I did mention that a key piece of that is roundtable discussions or industry days or RFIs that involve industry stakeholders and academia. However, if those avenues are not sufficient, you know, send a white paper, pick up the phone. I do think that a great part of the deliberative process of policy is that we are available to listen and to, especially in this area where the needle keeps moving so quickly, to help you help us give and put out the policy recommendations that will be most useful. But just keep engaging.
Excellent. I like to hear that. Andy, any thoughts from the UK?
To be honest, I just echo what Esni said, that pre-engagement. So early engagement with the regulator and with policymakers is the key to this. It's to ensure that we know what's coming around the bend. We know that there are new technologies emerging, there's new operational cases. As space operations become more complex, that early engagement is critical.
Yeah, we've covered the comments from the US and the UK administrations. I'm wondering if you and Will have thoughts on anything about other administrations are doing that may or may not be different. I do get the sense that from what I'm hearing and my general sense of the industry is that most administrations are open to talking and learning about the technology and helping. I mean, they have their own self-interest as well. And you know, there's a lot of gain for a country to be the first in many space activities. So, you know, tell us what's Japan, what's Australia doing, what are other administrations doing, if you know of any?
Maybe may I go first? So I think it's same as other countries that Japanese government is also open to talk to industry. But one thing I recently kind of observing is that there's a difference, I think, in the nature of the relationship between industry and the government from US and Japan. I think in the United States, industry is more proactive and you know, providing best practices or proposal on standards or things like that. And the US government is also, I think it's stipulated in the law that the government will adopt the industry's practice and in their regulation. But things are slightly different in Japan. I think Japanese industry, the companies more, they want a more clarity in the regulations, or they want a government to lead the discussion. So, and also in the US, I think fostering commercial space is one of the priorities for the government. And so I think governments, generally, they share the same stance of talking to industry and get to know the technology, but there could be a slight difference depending on the nature of the relationship with the industries, also the policy priorities. Thank you.
Thank you. Will, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, super quickly on the Australian front, and hopefully our regulators aren't on this call, so they can't refute what I say. But no, when I was listening
being
to
recorded,
Andy,
Will.
oh fuck, oh, I did not say that. Yeah, no. When Andy was speaking, I think that really echoes how we think about things in Australia. So similarly to the UK, it's the Australian Space Agency that regulates space missions, and we really care about our commitments under the Outer Space Treaty. And in our case, one of the weird countries, we also care about the Moon Treaty as well. So yeah, we definitely care about those things, and we want to be a good player in space and really have that rule-based order. Very similar.
Thanks. I just realized that there's a whole interesting conversation thread going on in the chat, which it's hard to follow while I'm trying to follow the verbal conversation. So I'll just pull one quick question that someone recently asked. I'm sure there's a lot of great questions even earlier, and then we'll keep moving on. But one of the questions was basically, and this was focused on US, but it actually applies across all administrations, but it really is about, with the varying government agencies, how do you ensure consistency among their approaches? And I'll leave it at that kind of high level question, and then maybe turn it over to whoever wants to step in the firing line first. And if not, we'll just give it to the home team and ask Esne to respond first to that.
I'll be interested to hear how Joe and others do this, but from our standpoint, from inside the house, what we encourage, and I alluded to this, that is, as you work with different agencies, OSTP for one has the authority to convene the interagency, which is why we have these interagency, committees and subcommittees. And I hope they don't sound terribly boring to you, but this is really where we get everyone seated at the table. So FCC knows what NASA is doing, and the DoD understands what, Commerce's concerns are. And so again, engage with us at this level. And what we would do is ensure that if you've talked to Commerce and but haven't had inroads to the FCC, we may be able to try to remove some of those silos. And there are a number of approaches that, again, I'm sure that commercial companies have already been using, but I don't think that you can over communicate in this area. I think that engagement with principals at different levels can ensure that we have better interagency coordination.
Sounds reasonable. Andy?
Yeah, I was just going to give some insight in terms of the UK and then more broadly internationally. So in terms of our national approach, as I mentioned, our regulator is the Civil Aviation Authority. So they are the national spaceflight regulator, and they look at both on-orbit activities and launch activities. So it's a bit more streamlined in the UK. So we have sort of a single front door, and then they engage across government in terms of the various stakeholders. And then from a government perspective, from a HMG perspective, then there's a number of government departments that are involved. So ourselves on orbit policy, and then the DFT, Department for Transport, leading on launch policy. And then that's we work with the CAA to implement. Then internationally, I think a good example is the work being done predominantly at the Science and Technical Subcommittee, UN COPIUS, on things like the 21 sort of on the long-term sustainability guidelines. So within that, there's 21 agreed guidelines, and they're split across national regulatory frameworks, space safety, R&D, and capacity building. And then principally on within this conversation, the national regulatory frameworks, that's a way we can then share examples of implementation. So a lot of the work that the UK is looking at the moment is how are these guidelines being implemented, so that we can share with partners and understand how these guidelines are being implemented, understand how the national regulatory frameworks exist globally, to try and understand whether there are coherence, whether there's best practice, where we can improve, and try and share some of our lessons learned. So I think that sharing internationally, particularly at forums like SDSC, is critical to developing this understanding of sort of global regulatory framework.
Yeah, Tony, I'll add in, I don't know what Esme was talking about a little bit, that, you know, in our experience, you know, that communication is really key that she was describing, you know, work with the State Department, work with each of the agencies to make sure that, you know, there is not going to be overlap in, you know, the oversight that you're being provided from the different agencies. And we were able to successfully do that. And if you're a ComSat operator, right? You go to the FCC and they regulate everything, you know, your safety as well as your TT&C comms. If you're an imager, you know, you go to NOAA and they also regulate your safety, your decommissioning, you know, your debris management plans. So, you know, we were able to negotiate the right approach, I think, that, you know, that NOAA would just regulate our imaging aspects and that the FCC would manage everything else. And that was done by, you know, that communication across the agencies and working with the State Department to establish that protocol.
Great. I think this is probably a good time to kind of segue into our last series of topics and then quickly wrap up with concluding remarks. But a lot of what we've been talking about has focused, and although we have touched on it, we've focused, I'll say, domestically, but like in internal governments, what policies. But I think key to this, I think others have mentioned it, is really collaborating internationally. And I want to turn it over to folks, and maybe we start with Aya, about what you're seeing out there on the international front, and how do you perceive that helping the industry as a whole?
Okay, thank you. So assuming what you mean by more like state-to-state level dialogues or discussion, and I think there is no, not so much concrete discussion at the global level at this point, at the state level, I mean, but as I mentioned earlier, the future missions will be global in nature. So definitely the coordination part will be the key. So the international discussion is definitely important. And in this regard, I'd like to touch upon some of the points, some of the important points, some of the points which I think is important for any future international discussions that relate to over-servicing. So the first is, I think everyone will agree that any discussion should not hinder or prevent innovation of over-servicing, because I observe sometimes there is overt emphasis on the dual use nature of proximity operation and on orbit servicing, particularly in space security or arms control forum. I watched the UNIDO space security conference Monday and Tuesday, and some of the delegation and panelists mentioned that RPO, of course, they are mentioning about military's RPO, but it's, you know, threatenings, and some panelists said it's so easy to turn servicer into weapons or things like that. So I really hope that rather than focusing on this threat or risk aspect, I hope the international communities promote or global communities see to have the discussion that promotes or to make a global community see the value of on-orbit servicing, because which is it's very important for benefit of the space economy and environment in the future. Thank you.
Esme, do you want to comment on the international front and the cooperation you've seen or new efforts you think should be made?
Thank you. I think Joe's example illustrated how we are working to help companies understand that they can, if they go to state, they can receive support in reaching out to other parts of the interagencies within the U.S. government. Another thing that state does quite well is coordinate with the UN and coordinate with other nations on these regulations and actually strategic operations for on-orbit servicing. So we support them as they continue that work, and they are very proactive in bringing up matters that we need to consider for new policies. And it's certainly an activity that we know we will continue to enhance and provide more to provide more opportunities for international cooperation.
Thank you. We are almost at the top of the hour, and I've been reminded that these are hard stops. So with that, I will leave you to the panelists with a minute or so, preferably 1 minute, to say any concluding remarks you'll have. And I guess we'll just go in reverse order from the introduction. So we'll start with Andy.
Yeah, no, thanks, Tony. So I think probably just picking up on the last points we were discussing on the international approach. I think it's critical both at a governmental level and then also at the industry level that these conversations continue, that policymakers and regulators can facilitate some of those conversations, and that ultimately that groups like CONFERS, like the Space Safety Coalition, that all of these groups are coming together and developing these best practices. So particularly from the UK, we're encouraged with that level of development. So yeah, I hope it continues. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. I'll turn one question I'll leave for the other four panelists, if they can weave it into their 1 minute remarks, is should commercial entities be leading the discussion, or is this more appropriate for state to state? So as an A.
Thank you, Tony, for the opportunity to be here and introduce our on-orbit servicing, assembly, and manufacturing interagency efforts. We are focused on, again, identifying all of the activities across the U.S. government, examining potential topic areas that are relevant in the R&D space and technology space, in the regulatory and policy spaces, to academia and industry stakeholders. And we look forward to hearing from you all and prioritizing activities to address community feedback, and also just developing a national strategy around on-orbit servicing. And it is important for us for a few reasons. One is we understand that on-orbit servicing can have a multi-generational long-term impact on humanity's life here on Earth and in space, and that it could really help provide a framework for space infrastructure from which emerging space companies can also thrive. So we are very interested in engaging and hearing your feedback and working with our commercial partners to understand what policy levers we can pull to ensure that American companies and others are successful in on-orbit servicing. So I don't think it's a state-to-state or a commercial leading. I do think that we need some coordination and cooperation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Aya?
Yes, I think it's not about who is leading. It's what is important is engagement. All the stakeholders need to engage together and to promote cooperation. So in this sense, I really appreciate the CONFERS efforts, to sort of encourage sharing best practices and discuss best practices. So really happy that I could join this panel, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Will?
Thanks again, Tony, for putting on the panel. It's been super engaging. So what's really jumped out at me, and I'll do some weaving for you, but all the panelists had some really good thoughts, and I think something Aya said that was really important is that governments are grappling with the dual use nature of space, and I think there's a transition happening from first it was military, and then there was kind of this old space style of doing things, and now we're going again into new space, and that transition is, I guess it's got a lot of legacy to it, and there's still a lot of important national security aspects. So we still need to consider. The other trend that I think is happening right now, and we've also talked about in this panel, is actually separate from on-orbit servicing, but really impacts what we do, and that is the trend towards innovation in ownership structures and space assets. Who the heck owns these things? Sometimes it's very unclear. I've seen models where there's an owner, but then someone else has built it and also operates it, and the owner almost has no control or power, and who is responsible then as well. So I think that's a separate issue as well. And then on-orbit servicing itself. So all that to say that I don't think that we should be leading this conversation, because I think there's two other trends, and we need someone to facilitate in the middle.
Thank you, Will. Joe, you get to back cleanup.
All right, thank you. And I see we're already at 12:01, so I'll try to go very quickly. I just want to, I think in my closing statement here, encourage the U.S. to really, consider continue pressing for this single mission licensing agency. I think that will simplify the process for all of us in the industry here. But make sure we're really creating a single agency and not just another branch that has to coordinate with the other branches, and just create another level. Let's make sure we do that right. Two, I really would like the agencies to affirm that space is a free place for commercial enterprise to happen, and especially when we look at remote sensing capabilities. I think we've got to start preparing our nation for that reality that's coming. And then also let's begin considering a frequency regime for servicing telemetry command needs. To enable this market to grow, we have to have a way to communicate with these spacecraft, and that's a real challenge for the industry, especially as you move outside of geosynchronous orbit. So those are my comments. Tony, thank you. It's been an excellent panel. Appreciate your
Thank you, everyone. And we should move on to our next event.